How dare you?
Eleanor Parker's voice cracked through the courtroom just as the maid's hand slapped her cheek, the sound sharp enough to freeze even the judge's gavel in midair. 7 months pregnant, veiled in black, and still raw from her husband's funeral, Eleanor's humiliation became public spectacle. The gallery gasped, lawyers, reporters, relatives, strangers, all of them watching a widow be struck down not by an enemy, but by the Whitaker family's maid, Margaret. The audacity wasn't random. Everyone could feel it. The maid had permission. She smirked, lips curling with confidence, as Eleanor staggered back, clutching her belly. Eleanor's hand trembled around the cold bench railing, her face flushed, not from the slap but from betrayal. Her in-laws sat unmoved, their pearl necklaces gleaming, their expressions smug. It was as if they were watching a play they themselves had directed. A woman mourning her husband, mocked by the very family she had once called her own. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how we arrived at that moment, we must go back just days before. Charles Whitaker, Eleanor's husband, had been the only buffer between her and his family's cruelty. A quiet man, gentle in nature but strong in conviction, he'd defended her against whispers that she was not their kind. The Whitakers were old money, judges, bankers, landowners whose names appeared on university buildings and hospital wings. Eleanor, a schoolteacher, had been branded beneath them. She remembered the first family dinner she attended, how Charles's mother had asked her to serve the soup, mistaking her for hired help. The snickers that followed when Charles corrected her still echoed in Eleanor's mind. Yet Charles had stood by her side, his hand firm on her shoulder. "This woman," he'd said that night, his voice cutting through their laughter, "has more grace in her little finger than this entire room combined." And yet Charles married her, cherished her, built a life with her. Their small cottage on the outskirts of town became a sanctuary. Sunday mornings found them reading the newspaper together, Eleanor's head on his shoulder, his hand resting on her growing belly. He'd whisper to their unborn child, promising a world where love mattered more than lineage. Their marriage wasn't just love. It was defiance against everything the Whitakers represented. But when death took Charles suddenly, a heart attack at 42 as he was pruning roses in their garden, the floodgates opened. Eleanor found him there, dirt still under his fingernails, a half-smile frozen on his face. The paramedics said he'd gone peacefully, but Eleanor knew better. Charles had died fighting to stay with her, fighting to protect her from what he knew would come next. His family didn't come to console Eleanor. They came to conquer her. The very next morning, before the funeral arrangements were even finalized, they arrived at her cottage like vultures circling carrion. Charles's brother, William, pushed past her without removing his hat. His wife, Cordelia, examined Eleanor's modest furniture with the disdain of someone appraising garbage. "We'll handle the funeral arrangements," William announced, not asked. "Charles deserves dignity in death, even if—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his eyes swept over Eleanor's simple dress, her bare walls, her second-hand furniture. The message was clear, even if his wife couldn't provide it. Every meeting about his estate turned hostile, every glance a reminder that without Charles, she was vulnerable. They questioned every receipt, every shared memory, every gift Charles had given her. "This watch," Cordelia had said, holding up Charles's father's timepiece, "belongs to the family. Surely you understand that." Eleanor did understand. She understood that grief had made her prey, and they were the predators. When the funeral ended, Eleanor hoped at least for dignity. Instead, the Whitakers delivered humiliation like a carefully scripted inheritance. They scheduled the estate hearing for the very morning she'd planned to visit Charles's grave. They sent their lawyer to deliver the notice personally, timing his arrival for dawn, knowing it would wake her from the little sleep she managed. On the morning of the hearing, Eleanor woke before sunrise, her back aching from the weight of her pregnancy. She'd barely eaten in days, her appetite vanishing with her husband. But as she stood before her mirror, Adjusting the black dress that had become her uniform, she saw Charles reflected behind her. Not literally. She wasn't losing her mind. But his words echoed. "Hold your head high, my love. You're worth 10 of them." Eleanor entered the courthouse clinging to her son's hand. Not a biological son, but Tommy, the 10-year-old neighbor boy whose mother worked double shifts. He'd insisted on coming, declaring himself Eleanor's bodyguard. His small hand in hers was the only warmth she'd felt in weeks. Her black dress was simple but dignified, purchased with the last of her grocery money. She'd pawned her wedding ring to pay for the lawyer, keeping only Charles's plain gold band on a chain around her neck. The Whitakers swept in moments later, draped in wealth and arrogance, their lawyer carrying briefcases of polished leather. William's suit cost more than Eleanor made in 6 months. Cordelia's pearls caught the courthouse's fluorescent lighting like tiny spotlights, each one a reminder of the distance between their worlds. They didn't acknowledge Eleanor's presence, speaking around her as if she were invisible. Behind them came Margaret, the maid, a woman who had cleaned Eleanor's silver and ironed her husband's shirts. A woman Eleanor had defended when Cordelia complained about a missed spot on a wine glass. A woman who had eaten Eleanor's homemade Christmas cookies and accepted Eleanor's hand-me-down coat the previous winter. Today she walked taller, her chin high, her smirk unshaken. Margaret had worked for the Whitakers for 15 years, invisible until useful, silent until needed. But Eleanor saw something different in her eyes today. Not just arrogance, but desperation. The kind of desperation that comes from people who've been promised things they've never dared dream of. The Whitakers had clearly offered her something valuable in exchange for her betrayal. Whispers trailed her like perfume. "Why is the maid here?" someone asked. "Because she knows too much," another replied. What no one in the crowd yet realized was that Margaret had been weaponized, her testimony, her brazenness, even her slap, designed to strip Eleanor's dignity piece by piece. As Eleanor sat down, Margaret brushed past her deliberately, leaning just close enough to whisper, "You don't belong here. You never did." The words hit Eleanor like ice water, each syllable a reminder of every family gathering where she'd been excluded, every conversation that stopped when she entered a room. It was salt on an open wound, a wound Eleanor had been carrying since Charles's coffin lowered into the ground. She remembered standing at the graveside, surrounded by Whitakers who'd mourned Charles's death, not as the loss of a beloved family member, but as an inconvenience that left them saddled with his inappropriate wife. The preliminary proceedings dragged on for what felt like hours. The Whitakers' lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual sneer, presented document after document questioning Eleanor's right to inherit. He challenged the validity of their marriage, suggested Charles had been mentally incompetent when he wrote his will, and insinuated that Eleanor had somehow manipulated her dying husband. With each accusation, the gallery murmured its approval. These were Charles's peers, people who'd never accepted Eleanor into their circle. They nodded along as if watching justice being served, rather than witnessing the systematic destruction of a grieving widow. Eleanor's own lawyer, a kind but overworked public defender named Robert Mills, did his best. But he was one man with a briefcase held together by duct tape, facing a legal army with resources Eleanor couldn't even comprehend. Every objection he raised was overruled. Every piece of evidence he presented was questioned. Then came the breaking point. When the Whitaker lawyer announced their final offer, he didn't speak with sympathy. His voice carried the tone of someone doing a favor they resented. He reached into his briefcase and produced a set of rusted van keys, holding them up like a prize. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "the family recognizes that Charles may have made promises during his illness. In the spirit of Christian charity, they're prepared to offer you this." He tossed the keys across the table so carelessly they clattered to the floor, skidding to rest near Eleanor's feet. "This is all that remains for her," he announced to the gallery, as if Eleanor weren't sitting 3 feet away. "One vehicle, a 1995 van with considerable mechanical issues. The family trusts this generous gesture will satisfy any claims Mrs. Parker believes she may have. The gallery erupted in cruel laughter. The sound bounced off the courthouse walls, amplifying until it felt like the entire world was laughing at her. Eleanor heard distinctly one woman's voice above the rest. "At least they're giving her something to live in." More laughter followed, each chuckle a dagger to her already broken heart. Eleanor stared at the keys, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. 7 months pregnant, stripped of her husband, they were now mocking her with the image of a rusted van as her inheritance. The van Charles had used for weekend trips to flea markets, searching for antiques to surprise her with. The van where they'd shared their first kiss after a summer festival. The van that now represented the Whitakers' final insult. As she bent to pick up the keys, her pregnant belly making the movement difficult, she heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath. The maid had been waiting for this moment, positioned perfectly for maximum humiliation. It was at that moment, as Eleanor's fingers closed around the cold metal, that Margaret struck her. The slap echoed through the courthouse like a gunshot. Eleanor's head snapped to the side, her hand flying to her burning cheek. The force of the blow sent her stumbling, and she had to grab the table's edge to keep from falling. The baby kicked violently inside her, as if responding to the attack on its mother. The slap wasn't just an insult, it was theater. Margaret had practiced this moment, timed it for maximum impact, and the Whitakers smiled like directors satisfied with the final act of their play. William actually began a slow clap, as if applauding a particularly good performance. Eleanor's plea, "Please, not here, not today," was barely a whisper. But it carried the weight of every humiliation she'd endured. The words were drowned out by chuckles and whispers from the gallery. Someone actually said, "She had it coming," loud enough for everyone to hear. But the sound that silenced them all came next, the sharp crack of the judge's gavel. The noise cut through the laughter like a blade, and suddenly the courthouse fell into absolute quiet. Judge Henry Caldwell was not a man known for leniency. Decades of service had carved his face into granite, his silver hair a crown of experience, his eyes a stow. He'd presided over murder trials without flinching, sentenced hardened criminals without emotion. But something about the scene before him, a pregnant woman humiliated, assaulted, mocked, stirred something deep within his judicial soul. He slammed the gavel again, harder this time. "Enough!" His voice boomed, shaking the courtroom windows, reverberating off the marble walls. The maid's smirk evaporated as if it had never existed. The Whitakers stiffened, suddenly aware that their power didn't extend as far as they thought. "This court," Judge Caldwell continued, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet, "will not be turned into a circus. Every insult, every assault, will be accounted for." He pointed directly at Margaret. "Bailiff, remove this woman from my courtroom immediately." Eleanor, still trembling, looked up at the bench and saw something different. Not pity, not curiosity, but recognition. The judge's gaze lingered on her longer than on anyone else, and in that moment, she saw something familiar in his steel-gray eyes. Something that reminded her of her own reflection. As the murmurs died, Henry Caldwell's voice cut through the silence. "This court will recess for 1 hour. When we return, every party in this room will conduct themselves with the dignity this institution demands." The gavel fell one final time. What no one knew, not the Whitakers, not Margaret, not even Eleanor herself, was that the judge carried a secret that would change everything. And that secret was about to be unleashed in the most devastating way. What do you think gave the maid the audacity to humiliate Eleanor so openly? Do you believe she acted alone, or was she following orders? Let me know in the comments. From there, the trial shifted dramatically. When court resumed, the atmosphere had changed completely. Judge Caldwell returned to his bench with a different energy, his eyes focused and determined. The Whitakers, once arrogant, now sat with visible uncertainty. Their lawyer kept glancing nervously at the bench, sensing that something fundamental had shifted. The Whitakers presented their arguments with polished arrogance, but cracks began to show under Judge Caldwell's relentless questioning. Their lawyer fumbled through documents, his earlier confidence evaporating as the judge challenged every assertion, demanded proof for every claim, and questioned the validity of evidence that had seemed ironclad just hours before. "You claim Mrs. Parker has no right to her husband's estate," Judge Caldwell said, his voice cutting through the lawyer's stammering. "On what legal grounds do you make this assertion?" "Well, Your Honor, the marriage was unconventional, and the family questions whether—" "The family questions?" The judge's voice rose dangerously. "Since when do families question legal marriages recognized by the state? Are you suggesting this court's marriage certificates are invalid?" Margaret, called to testify, stumbled through her words, her earlier bravado completely gone. She'd been coached, that much was obvious, but under Henry's piercing gaze her rehearsed answers fell apart. She contradicted herself, forgot key details, and eventually began crying on the witness stand. "Mrs. Margaret," Judge Caldwell said, leaning forward, "you struck a pregnant woman in my courtroom. Before I hold you in contempt, would you care to explain what gave you the authority to assault someone under the protection of this court?" Margaret's voice was barely audible. I thought they said she deserved it." "They said?" The judge's voice was deadly quiet. "Who is they, Mrs. Margaret?" At one point she dared smirk again, a flash of her earlier arrogance returning. Judge Caldwell interrupted sharply. "Do you think this is a performance, madam? Because I can assure you, the only performance here is your complete disrespect for the dignity of these proceedings." The gallery chuckled nervously, but this time the laughter supported Eleanor rather than mocking her. For Eleanor, it was the first moment she felt the tide turning. Still, whispers swirled. Why does the judge care so much? Why is he so protective of her? The Whitakers whispered among themselves too, confusion flickering in their eyes. They'd expected their money and influence to carry the day, but Judge Caldwell was treating their wealth like dust, their family name like an embarrassment rather than a badge of honor. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that something extraordinary was happening. Judge Caldwell wasn't just ruling on a case, he was systematically dismantling the Whitakers' entire argument, their entire worldview, their entire sense of entitled superiority. Then came the moment that would change everything forever. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, his hands clasped before him, his voice measured and deliberate. "Before I deliver my ruling, I must disclose a truth that I have carried for 34 years. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the court reporter stopped typing, her fingers frozen above the keys. 34 years ago, he continued, I was a young law student, idealistic and foolish. I fell in love with a woman whose father disapproved of our relationship. He was a wealthy man who believed his daughter deserved better than a poor student with dreams of justice." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Something in his voice, in the cadence of his words, struck her as familiar. "That woman became pregnant with my child. Her father gave her an ultimatum: abandon the relationship and give up the baby for adoption, or be cut off from the family fortune forever. She chose love over money, but the pressure became too much. She placed our daughter with a family who could give her opportunities I couldn't provide." The gallery was absolutely transfixed. William Whitaker had gone pale as death. "I've spent 34 years wondering about that child, hoping she found happiness, praying she found love. I've seen her name in birth records, watched her from afar, respected the distance her adoptive parents requested. But I never stopped loving my daughter." Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth as the pieces fell into place. The familiar eyes, the protective instinct, the way he looked at her with such recognition. Judge Caldwell stood, his voice growing stronger. "This woman," he gestured toward Eleanor, "is not just a plaintiff in my courtroom. She is my daughter." The chamber erupted, Gasps, cries, shouts of disbelief. Eleanor's vision blurred with tears as 34 years of questions suddenly had answers. The Whitakers looked as if they'd been struck by lightning. Margaret collapsed into her chair, finally understanding the magnitude of her mistake. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Reporters bolted for the doors, eager to spread the revelation across every newspaper and television station in the state. The Whitakers, once smug and secure in their superiority, now looked like children caught in the most catastrophic lie imaginable. Their power evaporated under the weight of Henry's authority as both judge and father. Every motion against Eleanor was denied. Every insult they hurled was nullified. Every attempt to humiliate her was now revealed as an attack on the daughter of one of the state's most respected judges. Margaret was held in contempt, sentenced to 30 days in jail, and escorted out of the courtroom as whispers followed her like a scarlet letter. Eleanor, who just hours before had been mocked, slapped, and humiliated, now stood shielded by the law and by blood. The gallery watched, breathless, as Henry delivered his final devastating blow. The estate belongs to Eleanor Parker and her child. The Whitakers will relinquish all claims immediately, and I hereby order a full investigation into their attempts to defraud this court. His gavel fell, but the sound was more than wood on wood. It was justice itself, 34 years in the making. When Eleanor walked out of that courtroom, she was not the broken widow they had expected. She was the rightful heir, backed by both law and legacy. Cameras flashed, headlines screamed, and whispers spread. The maid slapped the wrong woman. The Whitakers played the wrong game. Eleanor did not smile, but she lifted her chin. She didn't need revenge. Justice had spoken for her. But as the gavel fell and silence rippled through the courtroom, the story was far from over. What happened next would turn a shocking ruling into a scandal that shook the Whitaker family for generations. The courtroom's echoes of the gavel still lingered when the Whitakers scrambled to collect themselves. Their lawyer whispered furiously, but his words fell flat against the weight of Judge Caldwell's ruling. The once proud family, who had laughed as they tossed Eleanor the keys to a rusted van, now sat pale and rigid, their dynasty crumbling in real time. Margaret, the maid, was escorted out in tears, no longer smirking, no longer bold. The bailiff's firm grip on her arm was nothing compared to the weight of her humiliation. She'd gambled everything on the Whitakers' promise of reward, only to discover she'd chosen the losing side in the most public way possible. Every eye in the gallery was on Eleanor. Reporters scribbled frantically, cameras flashed, and murmurs spread like wildfire. But Eleanor didn't gloat. She didn't even look at the Whitakers. She kept her eyes forward, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly, the other clutching the van keys that had become symbols of her triumph rather than her humiliation, because in that moment, she had something far greater than revenge. She had justice, and she had dignity restored. More than that, she had family. A father who'd spent decades wondering about her, protecting her from afar, waiting for the moment when he could finally claim her as his own. Outside, the courthouse steps erupted into chaos. Journalists crowded for a statement, their microphones thrust forward like weapons. "Mrs. Parker, did you know the judge was your father? Eleanor, what will you do with the estate now? How do you respond to the Whitakers' humiliation?" But Eleanor, steady and unshaken, simply said, "I came here today to defend my husband's honor and protect my child's future." The truth spoke for itself. No anger, no theatrics, just the quiet strength of a woman who had survived betrayal and humiliation. The crowd erupted in applause. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt the chains of grief loosen, replaced with something she hadn't dared hope for: peace. Judge Caldwell appeared beside her, no longer the intimidating figure on the bench, but a father meeting his daughter for the first time in 3 decades. "I have 34 years to make up for," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "If you'll let me." Eleanor looked into his eyes, her eyes, and nodded through her tears. "I'd like that," she whispered. Charles would have liked that too. The Whitakers, however, faced a storm unlike any they had ever known. Headlines screamed, "Whitakers mock widow, judge exposes truth, and maid slaps heir in courtroom spectacle." Their fortune, once synonymous with power, now carried the stench of scandal. Business partners withdrew overnight. Politicians who'd once courted their endorsement now crossed streets to avoid them. Invitations to galas, once guaranteed, were quietly rescinded. Country clubs revoked memberships. Charitable organizations returned donations. They became a cautionary tale in high society, proof that arrogance, unchecked, eventually destroys itself. Eleanor didn't need to fight them anymore. Their own cruelty had done the work for her. Justice had not just been served. It had been served with interest. Compound interest accumulated over 34 years of separation between father and daughter. Weeks later, Eleanor stood in the garage of her modest home, staring at the rusted van. The same van they had mocked her with, laughing as if it were an insult. She ran her fingers over the cold metal, remembering the sting of humiliation, but now seeing it differently. Charles had loved this van. They'd taken weekend trips in it, exploring small towns and flea markets. He'd proposed to her in the back of this van, under a sky full of stars, promising her a lifetime of adventures. Now she understood why he'd kept it, why he'd refused the Whitakers' offers to buy him a proper car. As she opened the back door, she noticed something strange. Tucked inside a panel was an envelope, sealed and marked, "For Eleanor, if something happens to me." Her hands trembled as she tore it open. Inside were old papers, bonds and deeds that Charles had hidden away for safekeeping. Hidden wealth, untouched accounts, investments that quietly made the worthless van the most valuable inheritance of all. A handwritten note in Charles's familiar script brought fresh tears. "My darling Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and they've tried to hurt you. This van isn't just transportation. It's your freedom. Everything here belongs to you and our child. Don't let them take what we built together. I love you always, Charles." Eleanor's tears fell freely as she realized her husband had thought ahead, protecting her and their child even beyond the grave. The Whitakers had tried to strip her of everything, but in the end, Charles had made sure she had more than they ever imagined. By the time the next court session came, the Whitakers sat shrunken and defeated, while Eleanor's lawyers presented the discovery. Judge Caldwell, her father, yes, but more importantly, a man bound to justice, confirmed it. The estate was hers, the hidden assets were hers, and the Whitakers had no more ground to stand on. Their laughter had become their downfall. Their maid's slap had been their undoing. And Eleanor? She walked out stronger, not because wealth had saved her, but because dignity had returned, family had been restored, and love had triumphed over cruelty. Months later, Eleanor gave birth to her child, a son she named Henry Charles, honoring both his grandfather and his father. Judge Caldwell stood beside her in the hospital, not just as a man in robes, but as a father trying to make up for years of silence. He had once believed Eleanor would be stronger without his shadow, thinking his absence was protection rather than abandonment. But seeing her humiliation had broken that resolve. "You will never stand alone again," he promised her, as she held his grandson. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor believed him. The Whitakers faded into obscurity. No more headlines, no more prestige, no more power. They became whispers, cautionary tales told at dinner parties as examples of how not to behave. Margaret, the maid, vanished from society altogether, her betrayal earning her nothing but shame and a criminal record. Some said she fled town, others said she tried to sue for wrongful dismissal, but none of it mattered. Because the story that endured was Eleanor's, the widow who was mocked, slapped, humiliated, but who rose from the ashes with her head held high, her child's future secured, her dignity untouchable, and her family finally, miraculously, complete. So what do you think? Did the Whitakers get what they deserved, or should Eleanor have punished them more harshly? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you loved this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and share it with the people around you. See you in my next video.